Hello and welcome. My name is Dean Ray. I have the pleasure of organizing this session with Dr. Alex Bing, who's currently an instructor at Carleton University, Dr. Robert Nonomura, who's an assistant professor at Western right now, and then Dr. Neil McLaughlin, who's a professor at McMaster. And we have the pleasure of coming together to discuss Erich Fromm and Global Public Sociology, which is a book that came out by Professor McLaughlin last year from Bristol University Press. So Dr. McLaughlin is going to give us, Neil, is going to give us a bit of an overview of his book for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to have a sort of open thematic conversation around three areas, beginning with the history of Fromm and his ideas, the use of Fromm as an empirical case in public sociology, and then the contemporary relevance of Fromm. And then we'll have about 25-30 minutes at the end for questions and engagement from the audience. So without further ado, Professor McLaughlin, I'll turn it over to you. Oh, and I wanted to say, the way that this all came together is in 2017 at Ryerson University, Alex, Robert, Neil, and I actually participated in a panel, or not a panel, a roundtable on Erich Fromm. And at that time, all of us were using Erich Fromm in our dissertation work. And so it's kind of a red thread that's passed through all of our work. And here we are 5 years later, getting to celebrate this amazing book by Neil. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Neil.
All right, thank you, Dean. It's great to be with this group again and at the CSA. So I thought I would just tell you a little bit about my path to this book. So, years ago, it's a long path. As a Canadian who went to the United States to play soccer, and I was mobilized into the intellectual world, a place called Cleveland State, by Escape from Freedom. So this book kind of made me intellectual. And I was really sort of like influenced by the socialist Fromm, not so much the psychoanalytic Fromm or even the sociologist Fromm. And as I'm involved in the Democratic Socialists of America and kind of studying intellectuals who were speaking to the public. And eventually I sort of had to come up with a dissertation topic. And so I wrote a whole bunch of articles on kind of how Fromm became a forgotten intellectual and eventually got tenure in 2001. So there's a series of articles that are around. And then I kind of left the writing about Fromm, and I wrote a piece on Canadian sociology, kind of a crisis of Canadian sociology. I looked at other sort of case studies of public intellectuals, David Reisman, Orwell, Edward Said wrote about Canadian public intellectuals, and with Iga Mergler, I wrote about women public intellectuals in Canada. And I kind of got involved in this public sociology debate and kind of commentary and researching empirical studies of public sociology. And right now I'm studying source conspiracy theories and kind of the funding of higher education. So I really moved away for many years from the Fromm. And so I've come back. The book is kind of coming back to Fromm after those years. I have more things to say about Fromm that wasn't really finished. And I think there is a kind of a revival of Erich Fromm, or new interest in Erich Fromm. And unfortunately, part of that has to do with the rise of Trumpism and kind of, neo-fascism and the like. But the book is really putting together two different agendas, writing about Erich Fromm and then doing a sociology of public sociology. So the three goals for the book, and to some extent, there's sort of overlap, and our conversation here will go back and forth from them. But sort of the book tries to tell the story accurately of Fromm's career and his ideas and his public sociology. It's kind of intellectual history with a sociological lens. That's one piece. And then treat Fromm as a case study to see what we can learn about the difficulties and the value of doing public sociology. And then three, evaluate and reformulate, and the ideas need reformulated for today. So that's the book, and hopefully we can go through some of these. The sociology of public sociology, first, kind of getting the Fromm story right. So chapter 1 tells the story of Escape from Freedom, a 1941 best-selling book about kind of Nazism. Chapter 2 tells the story about how he became a public sociologist, from being a psychoanalyst and a sociologist, studied with Alfred Weber. Chapter 3 tells his influence on work in the 1950s during the Cold War on David Reisman, a kind of a very famous Harvard sociologist who wrote about the lonely crowd and conformity, and his influence on Marxist sociology and theories of alienation in the 50s. Chapter 4 tells the story of why he became a forgotten public sociologist. Chapter 5 tells the story. We often think of public sociologists as the ideas or the books they write. This tells the story of what activism he actually did in the 1950s and 60s. Most of his life, he wasn't really an activist, but in that decade, he did a whole range of political activity. So I tell the story of that. And then chapter 6 talks about social character in a Mexican village and anatomy of human destructiveness. 2 books at the end of his life where he returns to trying doing academic sociology or anthropology after doing political activism and therapy for many years, and he was a practicing therapist. So the sociology of public sociology, the second part. So I talk a little bit about why there's a canon of public sociology. We think of David Reisman, the sociologist who was first on the cover of Time magazine, C Wright Mills, kind of radical sociologist, Bois is being rediscovered. Jane Addams is one other example of a public sociologist that's being rediscovered, but we don't really talk about Fromm as a public sociologist. He sold more books worldwide than any of these scholars, and so I think he belongs in that history. And it's an interesting question why he doesn't really the history doesn't get told with him in the story. And then the question of Fromm as a case study. What did he do as a public sociologist, and what were the advantages and disadvantages for his career? So I take the case of Fromm in particular to raise some larger questions about, and sometimes when we talk about public sociology, we hear people saying public sociology is a bad idea. We need to restore scientific sociology. On one hand, other people are suggesting forget scientific sociology, science, the very idea. We need to be kind of changing the world. So the book is trying to kind of move beyond that and look at the case of Fromm, but ask us to do other studies where we try and think about what could be possible disadvantages and advantages of doing public engagement, both for the individual scholar and for the discipline as a whole. And there is a kind of a double-edged sword of public engagement. Fromm learned about the dangers of Stalinism and left authoritarianism because he was an activist, not because of his academic work. His distance from the sociological establishment allowed him to write about emotions, narcissism, and the irrational in a way that sociologists tend not to do. So being outside of the establishment helped him. He took neurosciences, evolutionary psychology, and Buddhism far more seriously than most 20th century sociological mainstream thinkers. Again, being out of the mainstream helped him, and he could write clearly, which isn't necessarily something that flows from our sociological academic training, I think. So at the same time, there's a disadvantage of his public sociological status, and maybe that's something we should think about for our discipline as a whole. Fromm became increasingly self-referential as he became a celebrity intellectual, and he wrote books that were sort of referring to his last books, and it's kind of became kind of a little bit out of touch with the literature, in the various fields, because his fame allowed him to publish anything he wanted. So there's a kind of disadvantage to that. He stopped engaging with the profession in a way that he may have benefited him more. And even today, in his case, it's a story of paperback books, a public intellectual with paperback books. So what does this involve now with social media? What are the dangers of celebrity intellectuals in the social media age? And so I'm calling for kind of case studies. And sometimes when we talk about public sociology at our meetings, they're almost like self-help sessions, where it's like, here's how you do public sociology. Here's how I did it. Here's the advantages. But it kind of assumes sort of like it's a good idea, and I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but I'm calling for sort of research, just trying to see what are the advantages, both for individuals, but for the discipline, and maybe, what is social media doing for our society, and what does that look like in the social media world? And then there is finally then the third issue is sort of like this revival is happening. There's conferences, and I've talked a little bit more about this, and you can find this on YouTube or again some talks recently. I can spell out this story in more detail. But narcissism, Fromm developed a sociological theory of narcissism, and from Trump to Putin, this is being discussed again. He developed a theory of collective emotions and collective narcissism. Coming back, he argued for theorizing authoritarianism from the left, from the right, and from the center. He argued for moving beyond consumer society in this book called To Have or To Be that Robert had mentioned a little bit before we started, and sort of an environmental, ecological perspective. And another issue is sort of like self-help books are everywhere now. Fromm is a self-help book, and bell hooks. Bell hooks was quite influenced by Fromm. So we have Erich Fromm and bell hooks on the left, and Jordan Peterson on the right. So there's a whole kind of sort of a politics of self-help and popular books and celebrity intellectuals. So thank you so much for giving me a chance to talk about this book and to engage. And I want to hear from everybody.
Thanks so much, Neil. That was amazing. I have a question before we really get down into the Fromm stuff. I was wondering if maybe Alex and Robert and myself could maybe explain how we came into contact with Fromm, how Fromm entered our lives. Yeah. Would you like to go ahead, Robert?
I'm just gonna unmute myself. Yeah, sure. My context was in an undergraduate social psychology course, and with Fromm's most famous book, The Art of Loving, as sort of one of a choice of various texts. You could do Mead, you could do Piaget, or you could do Erich Fromm. And so along the lines of what Neil was saying, Fromm's kind of socialist and Marxian influences, the humanistic dimensions of that attracted me to the work and kind of always glued me to it. But that I think very much stylistically and for I think young people, a book like that public facing, self-helpy a little bit element and the consideration of emotion just offered quite a richness that always resonated with me when it came to Fromm. And as Neil mentioned, later on in my graduate work, I became especially interested in To Have or To Be and Fromm's work, building on some of Marx's critiques concerning property and alienation.
Thanks, Robert. Alex, do you have a Fromm indoctrination story?
Yes, I do. I first came into contact with Fromm in 2012, when I just finished undergrad and entered grad school. My undergrad was in engineering. So, and in retrospect, it was a kind of an escape from freedom for myself and a lot of people in my shoes. When I first entered grad school, it was in the Faculty of Education. I had total culture shock making the science to art transition, and I was going through the philosophy library, desperately trying to derive from continental philosophy the right way, the polite way to speak in a seminar. And it was because that was the way which I was trained to think in my original discipline. And in that 1 year of frantically trying to play catch up on classroom manners, I came across Escape from Freedom, more or less by mistake. I think I was looking at the Frankfurt School. I started from Habermas, and then I looked at some of the older members of the Frankfurt School. I just saw the name of the book, Escape from Freedom, on Wikipedia, and I was like, that's an interesting name. I want to read this. And I read it from start to finish. I was like, why do I feel like this book is talking about me? and that was sort of how I started. I've gone on to do sociology since then, but interestingly, and perhaps with some regret, I've never been able to apply Fromm directly into my research and my work, but the shadow of Escape from Freedom sort of looms just outside the margins of the screen, if you will. Whether it's in the choice of what I study, in how I analyze what I study, how I parse the words coming out of the people I research, and so on. And it turned out after my doctoral defense, one of my second readers told me that I didn't know Fromm was your first guy. He was my first guy. Escape from Freedom was my first book. I was like, wow. So that popularity aspect, but not just that popularity aspect, but his political that political charisma of a public sociologist, being able to move people to not just open up to his ideas, but to change the course of their lives, but and also to give strength to people who are in the middle of changing their lives. So yeah.
I mean, I think the Fromm indoctrination stories are very similar. I remember I was reading Zygmunt Bauman's Liquid Modernity, and he mentions Erich Fromm in there. And I went to the stacks and I got Escape from Freedom, and I was reading it on the subway, and a history professor came up to me and she's like, I really like Fromm, you know, I read him back in the 70s and I really, really liked his work. And I was like, wow, if I carry this Fromm book around with me, people are going to take notice, you know, they're going to think I'm a real scholar. And I remember just like reading this, like Escape from Freedom, probably for like a month, and like people would see it and they'd be like, oh my God, Erich Fromm. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. So it just started from there. I started reading more and getting more into him and realizing how connected he was to a lot of the scholars that I was interacting with in my undergraduate career. So I think, yeah, I mean, and for me, that was really exciting. That really tied me to Fromm as a scholar. So I think that's a pretty good introduction to each of us and our interest in Fromm. I guess now we get to talk about the history of Fromm and his ideas. Any questions, comments, interjections, just go for it. If not, I have one.
Let me just throw one thing in here, because after hearing your stories. So my whole writing about Fromm came at an observation that I made. So being involved in the American Socialist movement, which, you know, I kind of worked closely with Michael Harrington, and Barbara Ehrenreich was around, and Cornel West was very active in the Democratic Socialists. So I was kind of around these people. And what I noticed, and then I went into sociology. So I was mostly interested in moving America to the left, you know, not become so obviously I did a very bad job, you know, like, and then I went into sociology, and I found that a lot of people became socialists because they read Erich Fromm, Escape from Freedom. There's like hundreds, there's thousands, many thousands who became socialists by reading Erich Fromm. But the closer you got to the leadership of the socialist movement at the top, the less they liked Erich Fromm. The sort of interest started to kind of decline. And the same thing happened in sociology. There are dozens and dozens, hundreds of sociologists who became sociologists because they read Erich Fromm. And back in the day, he was cited in the major journals. He had a PhD, Alfred Weber, Max Weber's younger brother. So these stories we're describing are very common. So that's the origins of my kind of research, is how could it be that someone influences a lot of sociologists and socialists, and at the core of the field, he gets rejected? So what is it saying about how fields operate, and how boundaries are created, and how people get inspired? And then what we do to do good sociology maybe is in contradiction with what we need to do to get new people involved. They're sort of like not the same thing. So that's the story, how this all came to be.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most interesting things to ask a sociologist is, how did you become a sociologist? And it's really interesting to see that Fromm is this thread that connects all of us together and many more people in the discipline. It was so interesting to encounter so many people at the CSA after I did a panel where I talked about Hannah Arendt and Fromm. And people came up to me and they're like, "Oh, Erich Fromm, I really like that guy," And it's one of those things where Erich Fromm becomes this sort of niche status object that we can use to interact around this whole sort of hidden sociology that people are deeply invested in.
But it's not that easy to use it in sociology. See, that's the
Well, then I guess turning to some of the aspects of your book, Neil, one of the questions that I kind of posed was a two-parter. The first part, I think, relates nicely to what we're talking about here, and maybe explaining one of the reasons why Fromm's positionality was such that so many people had kind of access his work, and that it resonated with people. You use the term optimal marginality in your book to describe Fromm's position in relation to both scholarly communities and publics. Because the book is so thoroughly cited, I went back and looked at the term. You kind of originally proposed it in 2001, also discussing Fromm. So I was wondering if maybe for those who are unfamiliar, if you could just summarize that concept of optimal marginality, and maybe share just any reflections or new insights that you've had on optimal marginality over the years, or especially as you've been reflecting and writing about Fromm, over what has now been, 20 years hence.
Yeah, I mean, that notion came out of that observation that he sort of has enormous influence, but gets rejected in the core of the discipline and the movement. So that's sort of, and it sort of led me to think about kind of the sociology of creativity. And sometimes when we think about this, there's sort of like these two different kind of major ways of thinking about it. Creativity comes from the center. It comes from Harvard. Robert Merton and Randall Collins, they have a version of this. It comes from Harvard, it comes from Yale, it comes from Western civilization, it comes from, studying with Mozart, and then you produce your own music. That's a sort of like, it's kind of, creativity comes from the center. And alternative view is that creativity actually doesn't come from the center. It comes from the margins. It comes from liminal spaces. It comes from people who are left out, who can see something that the center can't see. And there are lots of cases about this. And, Jewish intellectuals are kind of a case of that, right? But there are lots of others. So the idea of optimal marginality is try and break it down. Like when we talk about marginality, break it down into different forms. It's kind of intersectional kind of thing. Like what, is it kind of marginality in terms of where you come from in the center of the world capitalist system, New York or LA? Is it marginality in terms of you're at a top elite university? Is it marginality in terms of you are part of the mainstream of the discipline? Is it race or gender and some kind of class marginality? Is it network marginality? Or is it sort of an internal kind of sense? There's a great book by Edward Said, and he talks about his own kind of his own ideas, and he talks about how he was exiled from Palestine. But he also talks about his family. Like he never really felt at home in his own family, and Gramsci was also kind of a marginal and a psychological way. So there's a psychological level. So that's what I've been trying to kind of figure out. And in the case of Fromm, he had a unique combination of centrality and marginality. So he was connected to the major Freudian thinkers in his early years. He was connected to Jewish prophetic thinking by a number of rabbis that he studied with in New York. He was connected to the mainstream sociology. Alfred Weber was his dissertation advisor. He published with top presses in New York, and sort of that's part of explains his kind of fame. But at the same time, he never was an orthodox Marxist. He was never an orthodox Freudian. He was a public sociologist, but he never talked about being a sociologist, really, and he was quite contemptuous of mainstream sociology. His large parts of his family were murdered by Nazis, kind of white supremacist Nazis who murder his family. So, and he has a kind of a personal kind of sense of marginality too, and feeling not quite at home. So his creativity, I think, comes from this combination in that particular historical period of being in and out of different networks and different disciplines and different movements. So that's sort of and I think the chapter 2 I think I sort of refined that a bit and sort of started to understand. And he was also part of the Frankfurt School. So here's this group of people who, is sort of marginal in sociology or marginal in philosophy, continental philosophy, but not totally marginal. I mean, Adorno, Marcuse, of course, Habermas, they're major figures. But Fromm was a central figure in that network before, he was involved in it before Marcuse, before Adorno. He was a central figure and he got expelled from that. And partly he didn't feel comfortable with that. It was the Frankfurt School. And he ended up at Columbia University, another kind of central. Columbia University took the Frankfurt School as they were in exile from the Nazis, because Fromm did an empirical study of why the middle class and the working class were voting for Hitler, or at least didn't resist Hitler enough. So he was basically, and that the title of my dissertation is called "Escape from Orthodoxy," escape from freedom, but not finding and not sticking with any orthodoxy. That's a hard place to be. There's a tendency in intellectual networks to sort of stick with orthodoxies. I don't know if that's helpful, Robert, or.
Yeah, that's great.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
I wonder, sort of building on this optimal marginality piece, I wonder when Fromm became sort of optimal. What was the moment that sort of enshrined his career as an intellectual?
I mean, I think escape from freedom is really the key moment. This was a sort of, and I have chapter 1 talks about the making of a public intellectual with escape from freedom. And it was also, I mean, part of it was he wrote the book to try and get the US into the war. I mean, he was not a pacifist. He was anti-nuclear, anti-war, but he was not a pure pacifist. He thought that the Nazis had to be defeated. So he wanted to have by military power. He was quite, he was alert to what was happening. So I think Escape from Freedom sort of is the book that, and this connection to the Frankfurt School, elite Freudians, the mainstream sociology tradition. Is it sort of those 3 things with his own Jewish prophetic ideas? That sort of you combine those things in that particular moment with a book that becomes, it was reviewed positively in all the major newspapers. It was, Bertrand Russell loved Escape from Freedom. A whole range of top intellectuals were very impressed by the book. That was his moment. But it had like negative consequences, though, in a certain way, because his celebrity status kind of shapes the rest of his career. So it both created his opportunity to develop a sociology. But if it hadn't been for that, he might have just been a mainstream sociologist. He would be a professor at Columbia, died a professor at Columbia somewhere doing, a sort of mainstream sociology. So.
Amazing. Alex, would you like to add anything to our History of Fromm's Ideas section?
One of the things I've always wondered, and I've seen hints of it come up in Neil's book, is how exactly did he fall out of a favor with the Frankfurt School, and in particular, what really happened between him and Marcuse?
Right. Right. I mean, so I would say that, and I'm a big fan of sort of like without a vulgar Marxism, you know, but Marxists tend to look at the material conditions of everything except for their own lives and their own careers, you know. So I think you have to sort of think about what the Frankfurt School was. It's kind of like a brand later on. But essentially there was a German grain merchant who made a fortune in Argentina who had a son. And he gave the son his inheritance early. So they had money that they could support intellectuals. And the idea was you wouldn't have to be a philosopher going along with philosophy mainstream. And you wouldn't have to be a party activist for the Social Democratic Party or the Communist Party. The money allowed you to develop Marxist theory outside of the confines of the academic world or the party world. So that's what the Frankfurt School was. Initially, it was a little bit more pro-communist party in the early days. Then it became less focused on that. And the idea was trying to explain why Marxist theory didn't work. You had a Great Depression, which was an economic crisis. Why weren't people moving to the left? And you'd have a kind of a socialist revolution. Instead, you got Hitler. So it's sort of trying to figure out like what's wrong with Marxist theory, how we can kind of rejig Marxist theory, and using this money to bring in an interdisciplinary. It's one of the first sort of interdisciplinary research institutes. You got a philosopher. Horkheimer was the guy who controlled the money. Adorno got brought in as a kind of a cultural critic, and you had economists and political scientists. And Fromm was the social psychologist. So the question was, he did a study, it's called The Working Class in Weimar, and he was basically trying to take survey questions that were qualitative, not quantitative, but more interpretive, and you get people to talk about sort of their ideas. So the idea would be that some people who say they're for women's rights, a lot of the people in the socialist parties and the communist parties who say they're for women's rights. You ask them a question, are you for women's rights? They'll say, absolutely. But then you ask them other questions about, who makes dinner and, what about, what kind of clothes that women should be wearing. And you start to see misogynist ideas that come out. So the idea was to try and get at unconscious motivation. So the idea would be maybe people who say they're anti-Nazi are either kind of sympathetic to some of the authoritarianism or lacking a kind of a strength to fight it. So that was the idea. So they fought because a combination of things. So the Frankfurt School were investing. So Fromm did this study, and that's why they went to Columbia. So they had a kind of a base to survive the war at Columbia University. Robert Lind brought him in. And so they had a place to hang their coat for a little while during the war and survive there. But they weren't part of sociology. They weren't getting tenured positions. They were living on soft money, right? And essentially what happened was the Frankfurt School, they made some investments to invest that money, and they lost some money on the real estate market. So the money was kind of going down. They were spending a lot of money trying to get Jewish Germans out of the Nazi thing. So they were spending money, and they were giving money from and other people money. They were trying to do like today, trying to help Ukrainian intellectuals to kind of get away, or academics. They were kind of doing that in a certain way. And so the money was going down. Adorno came from a wealthy background. And so Fromm was he was sort of like too big for the Frankfurt School in a way. And he was kind of making his own kind of world and his connections. And Horkheimer wanted to replace Fromm with Adorno. And Fromm had his own money because he was a therapist. So he had a kind of an independent source of resource of money, where Adorno didn't, not as much. I mean, he's wealthy family, but he didn't have like a regular income. And so a lot of the Frankfurt School people were dependent on that money. And so essentially they lost some of the surveys, and the Frankfurt School didn't really like the survey. They didn't think, some of them were afraid, because part of the issue for Fromm was you have fascism. Of course, he was a deeply anti-fascist thinker. That's the whole point of Escape from Freedom. But he also thought there was something called left-wing authoritarianism. And the Frankfurt School people didn't really like that. They were sort of, they didn't want to go there. And then there's another issue, is that sort of, so there was money, there was kind of competition for these positions. There was a debate about the study. There's a kind of political debate. And also, Fromm didn't really agree with orthodox libido theory. He didn't think that instincts in Freudian theory was way to go. He wanted to refine Freudian theory, take the core insights about the unconscious and emotions, but see things in terms of search for meaning and connections and relationality. And later today, I would say that's in the optimal marginality piece. I basically say that Fromm's ideas have largely, in general, are much more accepted in psychoanalytic institutes today, this general move away from libido theory. But they killed the messenger. Fromm was sort of a messenger about that, and they took the message over years. So Adorno and Horkheimer were pro-orthodox theory, and then there were also kind of like competition over that study. So the authoritarian personality study, which is the most famous social psychology project of the 20th century, was done by the Frankfurt School network, Adorno, and a number of social psychologists at Berkeley. It was done, out of their funding efforts in the American Jewish Committee, but it was essentially a rehashing of Fromm's work. And Fromm didn't want to be part of that. He wanted to do his own thing. After Escape from Freedom, he just sort of like he did his own thing. And the history of the Frankfurt School was told through the eyes of Horkheimer. And I would say Marcuse, so the story of Marcuse is the story of one. Now, Marcuse was a philosopher who couldn't get a job in the U.S. He worked for the U.S. government. He worked for essentially the State Department or the early versions of the CIA, because he knew a lot about Russia and he knew a lot about Germany in the Cold War. So he couldn't get a job. He was, if you look at the letters, he was talking to Horkheimer saying, "I want to be part of, critical theory, to develop critical theory." And Horkheimer says, no, get a job in philosophy. Horkheimer didn't want to be paying him to do this. And so so Marcuse was quite on the margins, and Fromm was famous. And then Marcuse wrote a very famous critique of Fromm in a left-wing magazine called Dissent, which led to this book. It was a segment of the book called Eros and Civilization in 1956, which was a critique of Fromm, basically saying Fromm was a conservative thinker. When he left Freudian theory, he became a conformist thinker. And then Marcuse became famous in the 1960s and the later part of the 60s. And a lot of the 60s activists became kind of academics, and they took the sort of the view of Fromm that they got from Marcuse into their worldview. And so I think that's kind of, and plus he wrote The Art of Loving, which at the same time, right? This happened at the same time. So he writes this book, The Art of Loving, which actually is a critique of capitalism, and a very powerful book. But it, for academics and elite intellectuals, it's too popular. It's sort of like, this is like, I know someone who once said to me, if a German intellectual, quite prominent intellectual in Canada, but originally from Germany. And she said, Erich Fromm is a book for teenage girls. That's sort of how she saw it, not a serious intellectual. I don't have a problem with writing books for teenage girls myself. Like, what do you say in those books is really, it's like the key issue. And the book is sort of dated in many ways around gender and sort of essentialism, but it's a critique of capitalism. It's a critique of how capitalism makes loving difficult. And that's where Bell Hooks takes that up and makes it more feminist, deals with the Black radical tradition and anti-Black racism, and kind of improves on Fromm's work, but they're doing the same kind of thing. But academics don't like that. So
that's great. So we should probably turn to I mean, we could talk about Marcuse and Fromm all day.
Right.
But we should probably turn to Erich Fromm as an empirical case in public sociology. And I found that this was one of the most interesting components of your book, because it turns out that we're having a lot of debates in sociology about whether public sociology is good or bad. And it's kind of this recurring debate, and you see a lot of that. Should we be public sociologists, or should we be more policy oriented or more sort of like academically focused? And the really interesting thing that you bring out in the Fromm case is that there's pros and cons to each one of them, but the way that we go about public sociology can have repercussions for how people think about the world, but also for what it means for a sociologist. And so I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about Fromm as the public sociologist.
Yeah, so after that book, and I think that when we get to the story, the book is the story of public sociology after the paperback gets invented and before the creation of social media, right? It's a story of that, where people write big books, and there's a whole kind of discussion in sociology about big books. Margaret Mead, Noam Chomsky, kind of C Wright Mills, he's kind of big. The Other America creates the War on Poverty, kind of Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. So it's a story of what happens when someone gets famous from writing books. And so it's something like 70 million copies his books were selling. Like that's something, at least that. And now the global public sociology part of it, if you look at Google Scholar and this revival that's happening, more and more citations, conferences and things, that usually, and I check it regularly because I'm kind of curious, it's not just in sociology, but usually more than half of the citations to Fromm are not in English. So he spent time in Mexico. He lived for 15 years in Mexico City. He was very involved in the former Yugoslavia with the Praxis group, a group of humanistic Marxists. So Poland, so Eastern Europe, Latin America, all over Europe. So he had this, in Japan, he was quite influential. There's a lot of influence of Fromm's ideas in China today, although it's kind of a little bit complicated, because he was quite critical of authoritarian one-party systems. So there's a bit of a complication there. So after Escape from Freedom, he becomes someone who the presses will publish anything he does. So he becomes he writes Man for Himself. And so here's another funny story about this, right? It's like Man for Himself influenced David Reisman. David Reisman is one of the key people that sociologists in America talk about public sociology. So The Lonely Crowd is the best-selling sociology book of all time. David Reisman didn't have a PhD in sociology, but he writes this book, The Lonely Crowd. And The Lonely Crowd was essentially a revision of Fromm's ideas in Man for Himself, where he talks about his gendered language is one of the problems with Fromm's ideas, is kind of gendered humanism. And Lynn Chancer has written some really good things. So that's one thing we have to kind of think about in terms of reformulating some of these ideas. So a lot of his work and even his politics, right, were framed around, he was so famous that he didn't have to, and he was independently wealthy at this point from the book sales and from his therapy, right, that he didn't go to sociology meetings. He didn't publish. There was a critique of Fromm in one of the sociology journals, AJS. They kind of wrote it. He wrote in ASR. He published one article in ASR, and then somebody wrote a critique of Fromm. And if you go through the letters, he sort of like he had a chance to respond, and Fromm was like, "Who cares what American sociologists think of my work?" This is like. So there was a little bit of a kind of an arrogance there, or maybe, and a kind of. But at the same time, I mean, that's the ambivalence. I'm kind of looking for an ambivalence. It's sort of like, can we connect with the mainstream? Can we kind of engage with sociological mainstream without being owned by the whole thing, right? And that's sort of, so that's what happened with Fromm. And I think over time, he drifted away from doing research, and he kind of came back to it at the end, where he tries to kind of, he wasn't doing peer review research, from 1943, 44 to really to the end. He stopped doing peer review, right? Because he would do popular books. So I think that kind of created, in his case, it kind of created a little bit of a self-referentialness to it. And it sort of damaged, I think, his ability to put his ideas up against peer review. And although you see in Anatomy of Inhuman Destructiveness and Social Character of Mexican Village, he tries to do that again and does a decent job, and those books are worth reading. But I think that was a sociological problem. And I think it's something we all have to think about today. Sort of there's a temptation to write to the public, to get on Twitter, to write on the conversation. There's a value to that. But what does it do to your ability to just sit in the library and get that really good book done, or continue that, or put your ideas up against kind of critics who, Fromm is very different from Peterson. Politically, I'm very sympathetic to Fromm, excuse me, not Peterson, but there's a Frommian slip, that's totally not true. But that's what happens if you become so kind of a celebrity that you're no longer, you're surrounded with people who want to have you endorse their book, or go on your podcast to sort of sell your book. Fromm was not at that level of it wasn't social media. But I do think the sort of the fame and the publishing in popular books hurt his sociology. So that's the question, that for today, I think we all have to struggle with and frame it as a kind of not an easy answer. It depends on your individual, it depends on your case, right? So you got to make a decision on your own. But there's also a question about what does it do for sociology, right? What combination of these roles do we need? That's what I like Michael Buroway in his Public Sociology article, the professional, policy, public, and critical sociology. The key question is what combination? The question is not, is public sociology good or bad? The question is what combination of these different roles in particular disciplines in particular countries is the best for individuals and for the discipline and for the society. That's sort of I don't have an answer to that, but the Fromm case sort of raises that, I think.
Well, just as a follow-up then, there's also this, I guess, a dialectic to Fromm's popularity, but then also what you explore later in the book, his decline. Chapter 4 discusses how Fromm became a forgotten public sociologist. And I think what's really interesting about the analysis there is that you explore, not just as we've talked about just now, his debate with Marcuse in Dissent, some of his own individual choices and characteristics, but also the sociological mechanisms, these larger divisions in the discipline that I think are still relevant today in various forms. So on, for instance, page 113, you write that the forgetting of Erich Fromm's public sociology has to do with the policing of the boundaries between professional and popular sociology. So as far as Fromm's cases, providing kind of this sociological insight into public intellectualism, even in terms of the markets of mass communication, like you were talking about in terms of book sales, there's also this kind of institutional dimension, I think, in terms of academia, gatekeeping and things, and more specifically, I guess, the parochialism of Orthodox Freudianism and Marxism. So I was wondering, in exploring sort of what the pros and cons are, what some of the challenges that people might want to navigate as public sociologists might be, if you could kind of discuss some of those structural and institutional drawbacks that Fromm faced, and maybe their implications for how we might think about developing a public sociology that is engaged with both current academic literature, but also with publics who can generate new insights or name problems that might not be as apparent, within the ivory tower.
I mean, one of the issues is the kind of the dogmatic orthodoxies within intellectual systems. So in the case of Fromm, it's like basically he was a Freudian who didn't believe in the Oedipal complex, an orthodox Freudian theory, right? And he thought that, that basically the Freudian theory was patriarchal and had to be subjected to a critique, a sort of a proto-feminist critique, which is so. The problem with that is is that anti-Freudians hate you because you're promoting. He was the most popular Freudian thinker, other than Erik Erikson of the 20th century, popularized Freud in America. So people who are behaviorists or cognitive psychologists or neurosciences or sort of technical Jungians, Fromm, Peterson really dislikes Fromm. He never mentions Fromm because he's a Jungian. It makes sense, So these sort of these kind of sectarian divisions. But in Fromm's case, Freudians hated him even more than anti-Freudians because he was challenging this the sacred aspect of Freudian theory. And in the case of Marxism, he was a Marxist and who believed, and Du Bois is a greater sociologist than Fromm because he spent more time on sociology. So I'm not arguing that Fromm should replace Du Bois. Du Bois is a better scholar and a more important sociologist. But Du Bois, if you see in 1953, Du Bois wrote a really terrible obituary for Joseph Stalin, basically that starts off with Joseph Stalin is a great man, and then it gets worse from down there. Now there's a lot of reasons why Du Bois would come in the orbit of the Communist Party, and it's not all on him, so that's a kind of complicated story, but that's a limitation to be diplomatic about it. And so that was the problem that Fromm had, is that he was anti-capitalist and anti-Stalinist, anti-Maoist, anti-Bolshevik. So I think that's a good road to run. Both those things. I think we need Freudian theory, but we got to modify it, and we need a radical critique of capitalism, but we got to watch out for authoritarian elements of the left. That's not easy to do that. So some things are sort of like more important than what keeps your reputation going, right? That's sort of, so some of the things that Fromm did, I know that's hard to sort of to believe in the days of Twitter and kind of citation counts and all that stuff, but really there are more important things than your academic reputation is your principles. So there's kind of that, and then there is this. It's very hard to sort of like Fromm is sort of like, and I end the book by talking about Alvin Goldner. So he has this great book called Two Marxisms, where he talks about how theoretical systems and disciplines have nightmares. So sociology's nightmare is that everything can't be explained sociologically. There's a sort of an existential and a personal and a psychological level to life that we have to understand. And Fromm was never comfortable totally in sociology. So I think that's sort of a good thing. But it's sort of, it's difficult for a discipline. Disciplines are not going to go along with that because disciplines have to police those boundaries, right? And then the final thing I would say is, we need to talk to people and engage with people. Very complicated. Twitter is making all of this complicated, but we need to talk to people outside of the academic elite and outside of the intellectual elite, the Globe and Mail and New York Times. We have to talk directly to publics. And Fromm did that. That made him vulnerable. And it's complicated to do.
Awesome. So we will throw to Alex for a question on the contemporary relevance of Fromm, and maybe shift registers over to what Fromm can tell us about all of these events that we're living through.
Yeah. I just sort of fondly remember, like a few years ago, reading the rereading Escape from Freedom, but it was the edited version written during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
And in the intro to the revised version, Fromm says, I think what was it would have been in the early 60s, right?
Yeah.
And he says, I believe that unfortunately, the stuff I wrote in my old book is still relevant today.
Yeah.
In light of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Fromm is no longer with us today. But I suppose one could hypothetically ask, what would Fromm write on the introduction of another reprint? I believe a digital reprint came out like not too long ago of Escape from Freedom. And I
Right.
remember buying the digital version.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the most important question isn't what Fromm would write, but how are we going to rewrite Fromm and use his ideas and improve it? I think that's kind of the most important question. So I think that the relevance of Fromm is clear. You know, I mean, he was very passionate. That was part of his connection to David Reisman. He was actually David Reisman's psychoanalyst, and so he helped him sort of like deal with his insecurities around being an academic because he didn't have a PhD, and his mother was very kind of pressuring him, and so their relationship had that kind of the beginnings. But essentially, Fromm became his mentor, and they did politics together. So the organization SANE, which was a very influential anti-nuclear organization and around the threat of nuclear war, the organization was named after Fromm's book, The Sane Society. So, and he gave a lot of money to this. So that's part of the story. Fromm's politics was around kind of giving money because he was wealthy and giving speeches and letting people use his name to recruit, right? It was sort of like that. He wasn't actually kind of like that much of a good activist because he was sort of like a more of a famous intellectual that kind of people used. So I think that we are living in a period, he was obsessed with the danger of nuclear war. We're obviously living in a period where that is relevant today. And I do think that looking at the Ukraine situation, I mean, I don't think we should figure out like, you know, what did Fromm say about this, and then we should do with that. But he's sort of like a guide to it. It's sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, there are times to fight and have wars and defend yourself, but at the same time, we shouldn't be giving carte blanche to military budgets and forget about the role of the U.S. in this crisis. So, with no sympathies whatsoever for Putin and authoritarian Russian regime, but not kind of blind acceptance of. So it's sort of kind of that general orientation of anti-capitalist and anti-authoritarian. Also, and I do think in this case, with the Putin case, you can't explain Escape from Freedom basically says you can't explain Nazism with Hitler's psychology only. It's not a case of this crazy man, right? That's not, it has historical, sociological roots. We have to understand history and politics and sociology. It's not just a crazy man. But at the same time, you can't understand this situation without something about Hitler's personality and his pathologies. And at the same time, I would say that's true with Trump, and that's true with Putin. We have to find the right balance is sort of the question that I would put on the table. Like, what is the right balance? Of course, psychologists and sociologists, that's the escape from orthodoxy, the marginality kind of question. They think it's all about psychology, and we dismiss psychology. So we have to aim to kind of find the right balance, and Fromm's a guide for that. The other thing about Escape from Freedom, I would say, is that how I would rewrite it, is that he basically says that that the Nazis are a lower middle class movement. And so I don't think that's true. I think that historical research has shown pretty clearly that it was a cross-class movement. There's a bit of a class bias in Fromm there, you know, the lower middle class. We kind of see that, I think, maybe today, you know, when we're looking at Trump supporters or, you know, the convoy supporters, there's a kind of a little bit of a class bias there that Fromm had, and that intellectuals have. Of course, intellectuals have that. So I think that's where the sociologists have to come in. That's where we need to be more empirical than Fromm was. We have to figure out who actually supported. Historians have done this. Fromm was mostly wrong about this. He had some insights, but I think he was mostly wrong about this. Who supported Hitler? It's one question. Who supports Trump? Who supports the convoy? Let's get empirical on this, not and this notion of narcissism, right? Can we really say that narcissism as a kind of psychological thing doesn't exist with Putin and Trump? I mean, I don't think, but we can't explain the whole thing by that. And that's not a strategy either. It's not a political strategy, calling people narcissists, right? That's not political strategy. So we need to kind of find that's what I would say about escape from freedom. I guess the other thing I would say about escape from freedom is that there is confusion. There is so much social change. People are anxious. People are kind of looking for answers. And that's happening today again, and that's the rise of conspiracy theories and that kind of the right. So I think we have to sort of like focus in using Fromm as a jumping off point, but not taking his answers in Escape from Freedom as the right answers, I think.
Amazing. So we'll open it up to questions from the audience in just a few moments, but I'm wondering if maybe we could go around and ask Alex, Robert, and myself, I guess, what we see as the contemporary relevance of Fromm today. And there's two things that I want to say. I think that as a global public sociologist, I really see a lot of resonance between Escape from Freedom and Fromm's understanding of sort of capitalist atomization and what's happened in the Philippines over the last 6 years. And I think that Duterte, who is no longer the president of the Philippines, and his focus on drug addiction, right? It really speaks to the way in which the bonds of community have been destroyed in the Philippines, right? Especially around the family, but also in like rural villages and the pace at which urbanization has happened there. And it sort of welded those bonds together, right? It allowed for them to escape from the existential burden of this new freedom. And I think that like more than any case right now, right? The Philippines really speaks to what has happened in Escape from Freedom. The other thing that I find really relevant about what Fromm said is the worker study, and particularly the place in history that the worker study occupies. Because in 1923, in the Weimar Republic, we had a failed insurrection, right? Hitler actually marched people into the Reichstag trying to take over the government and basically overthrow, goodbye, Mervyn, overthrow the government, right? And it completely failed. He goes to prison, he writes Mein Kampf, right? And then 10 years later, he comes back and he's allowed to run an election again. And we see him sort of crystallize this amazing victory. And I think that people sort of discount the insurrection that happened on the American Capitol too easily, right? Because I think that what it does, it might not have been successful in its explicit aim of trying to take over the country, right? Trying to overturn an election, but it galvanized a group of people, right? It created sort of a new form of solidarity around this myth over whether you believe the election was stolen or not. And that kind of myth, right? It is enthralling. It becomes captivating for people, and it creates all of these shared feelings between people. And I think Fromm really gives us the tools to understand how that myth is interacting with our society. So that's where I see the contemporary relevance of Fromm today. Maybe we'll go to Robert, Alex, and then back to Neil, and then we'll open it up for questions. Sound good?
Did you want to go first, Alex, or shall I?
I don't mind either way.
Yeah, maybe if you don't mind, I had a couple of things that I'm just gathering together in terms of an idea.
Okay, sure. I'll one of the things I've been thinking about is whether the extent to which the petty bourgeoisie as a category remains relevant to our sociological imagination, even in light of understanding what is going on in populism or authoritarianism today. Now, I know in one of the closing chapters of the book, Neil explored this potential overlap between Bourdieu and Fromm, and how Fromm has furnished a lot of Bourdieusian concepts with psychological depth. In my view, one of the Bourdieusian terms that has really languished, because without psychology, it's hard to define, is this idea of homology.
Yeah.
And how people take, like, how can you explain homology without referencing Freudian terms like transference? And that's something that, again, is hard to explore openly in orthodox sociology. So that's one thing. But back to this idea of the lower middle class, I think one of the ways in which Bourdieu, or I would gently suggest that one of the ways in which Bourdieu can furnish the Frommian framework, is to provide a more empirical and also more theoretically nuanced dissection of the lower middle class. Like, in distinction, for example, Bourdieu would say that the lower middle class may or may not vote right wing, depending on A, their social trajectory, and also B, their capital composition. Like, it's not just the volume of your privilege, it's also the makeup, the composition of it. And that's certainly something that I've encountered in my research, where the composition of one's privileges really seem to be a bigger decider of where one politically leans. That's another, so that's another point. So one point about homology and psychology, and homology and transference. Another point about whether, or the extent to which, we can rehabilitate sort of this focus on the petty bourgeoisie. And very quickly, I think a third question is authoritarianism in the academic setting.
Yeah,
I know Neil also mentioned this in his book as well, naming outlining this as one of the major, and I would agree totally that this is one of the major areas of concern in our own, in studying our own societies. And yeah, I actually want to leave that question open. I mean, I have some of my own views on how to go about analyzing this. And again, it would just rehash this idea of look at capital composition, and look at the capital composition of actors in the university, which, you know, could rehabilitate some of the insights that Fromm had about the lower middle class, but keeping in mind that, you know, from a sort of overlapping a Bourdieusian lens on top of that, or Bourdieu would say that the petty bourgeoisie within the academic setting are people who are low on cultural capital, and they struggle with cultural capital. And what would their strategies be in navigating a space where their own cultural capital is low? In some disciplines, it may result in cancel culture, for example, in the arts, you know, the censorship of certain ideas. Whereas in the sciences, this may manifest in ableism, like brutal ableism, which is a theme that's popped up. Oh yeah, so some more, just more or less those ideas, open questions.
terrific.
Yeah, I had a few thoughts just as I was reading through the book, especially as again, Neil speaks to all of these different dimensions and kind of what I guess could be categorized as like subdisciplines of sociology that Fromm's influence has has touched. One of the things that, I hadn't reflected on in the same way prior to reading Neil's book was Fromm's contribution to the social psychology of emotion, and how his theories of aloneness might kind of inform insights into current research on alienation and social isolation, especially given what people have experienced during the pandemic and its aftermath. Neil, in kind of proposing Fromm's relevance to emerging issues after the pandemic, you touch on political economic implications, the collapse of the neoliberal global consensus, but there's also this element here that I think is worth exploring about the way that Fromm's work can help us understand these effects of aloneness during the pandemic. As you kind of spoke to a handful of times throughout the book with regard to the importance of avoiding aloneness in Fromm's in Fromm's conception of the human being, to be related to the world outside oneself as this critical existential component, a thing that's vital to human beings' psychosocial development, as he discussed in The Art of Loving, and of course the implications and the dark side of that in Escape from Freedom, where just drawing from what you've written, where Fromm talks about the intolerability of moral and psychic aloneness. And anyway, so thinking of these kinds of experiences of aloneness that people have had in various ways and under various conditions during the pandemic, and then the inflammation of social conflicts during these kinds of times. There was one passage that really stood out to me, just as something that, I've been reflecting on ever since, where you write kind of the need to relate to the world is an even more powerful driving force than instinctual dynamics. Humans will turn to religion or nationalism for refuge from what man most dreads, isolation. And you quote Fromm in terms of man, of course. So it's man sick. But that's kind of my general observation. I think that Fromm's social psychology, his understanding of emotions, and the ways in which we as sociologists can draw upon those things might help deepen the ways that we think about isolation during the pandemic, and also how we might, as public sociologists, seek to revitalize a sense of social solidarity in the aftermath of this kind of, immense crisis. So those were my thoughts.
That's great. I mean, I think that, the irony here, and if you do a kind of a sociology of academic institutions, since Fromm, I mean, we're living in a world of incredible credential inflation, right? Where you have to publish and publish and publish, and so the things that Fromm did are like really hard to do. So they're not really good career strategies, in this contemporary. They're just not, right? And it's precisely, this is the optimal marginality. It was precisely the fact that he was famous and all of his money that allowed him to do that. And it's sort of not a very good path for other people. Right, that's sort of the irony.
I did have a question I'd written about what about for those of us who might be suboptimally marginal?
Right. Yeah. Well, yes. Well, I mean, the goal is not to be suboptimally marginal and try and find a strategy. And so what I would say is we don't need a Frommian analysis of the Philippines, right? We need somebody who knows a lot about the Philippines and to sort of like try and use Fromm carefully to refine what people are writing about the Philippines and add something that Fromm saw that mainstream political sociologists or political scientists don't get, right? We don't need to replace Bourdieu with Fromm. That's a very bad idea, and I do agree with Alex. I mean, Bourdieu had a research team. He has a framework. It's much better than Fromm as a sociologist, right? I would say that Fromm had a better understanding of emotions and instincts, not as instincts, but as meanings. And it's kind of, he had a better thing. I don't know if sketches from a life, the Bourdieu, but he basically says the most important thing to understand about a person is their field position. Well, that's so stupid. I mean, that is so stupid, I mean, the most important thing from a Bourdieuian, theory is their field position. But, it's only one piece, right? So go with the field position and the kind of stuff that you're working on, the lower middle class, those kind of things. Go with that because it's a good model. But see if the Frommian framework can add something that the Bourdieu framework can't, precisely because of his centrality in sociology, because he has all the incentives to make this a fully sociological explanation. Don't do a fully sociological explanation. Trying to find some things, and and Robert, yes, that optimal marginality. You'll stay on the optimal marginality if you try it. You'll be continually optimally or suboptimally marginal if you try and force Fromm into sociology in a way it's not going to work. It's not going to help your career, and it's not even going to help analysis, because we have all this other stuff that's been done since then. But I think Fromm has something around the emotions, and I would say that with I do agree with Dean that this is a fascist moment, a pre-fascist moment. I mean, there's no question about that. There's no question about that, and it's also a moment of a kind of an authoritarianism on the left too, and among academics. And I would say Jacobin had a thing about why Jordan Peterson is wrong about everything. That's not right. Nobody's wrong about everything. I mean, that's just stupid. But he's wrong about a lot. It's mostly wrong, but he's got some good questions that I think this kind of, if you want to understand why he's so popular, it has to do with these questions. Partly has to do with some of the horrible things he says and his behavior and Twitter. I mean, that's true too. But there's something about kind of how people are feeling alone. They're feeling confused. They're feeling, and he's speaking to that. And we need to speak to it better. But build back better.
Amazing. What a wonderful discussion. I will open it up to the floor for questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll throw it over to you.
Zoe had a question.
Yeah, she did a comment. Zoe, would you like to Oh, I see that you've unmuted, but maybe your microphone's not working.
Sorry, do you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was just saying that I joined late because there was a mix-up in my kids' school, blah, blah, blah. I had to go back there, and then by the time I came back, this is almost over, and I'm really sorry to have missed it. But I just joined in time to hear Neil talk about the totalitarianism on the left. And this is something that has really, I have been trying to grapple with it for a couple years, and it's easy to, like, for a person who identifies with the left, it's easy for me to criticize the right. It's like, it's safe to do that when you are kind of hiding among the left, and you know that they will support you and they will nod and they will agree with you and all of that. It's very it's dangerous to criticize the left, and the people who are most like you are most likely to devour you and tear you apart. And so I'm wondering, how do we do that? There is this moment where there is an instinct to tear everything apart rather than build. There is this instinct, like scorched earth, essentially, strategy. And from both sides, from the left and from the right. And it's very dangerous. And I feel very threatened. I feel very bad about our future. I feel that the common ground is eroded every single day. And I can say this from a third world perspective. And I've seen way worse. And I've seen what happens when the common ground is eroded.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, having missed the entire session, I'm wondering, how do we get out of this? Can we get out of this? Is this one of those cycles in history where like we all devour each other and then we just go back to the starting point, or, you know, yeah, sorry, I'm just rambling on.
No. I mean, I think that we have to be tougher, I think, on the role of Twitter and social media, so I mean, really, like from a socialist and an anti-capitalist perspective, you hand over your public sphere to these companies, these profit-making companies, who have totally dominated this and transformed and eroded sort of public spheres of newspapers, advertising, and things, and it's creating a really toxic conversation. So I think it's totally impossible to deal with the questions that we raised here on Twitter. Like you have to have some space to sort of develop the argument, to kind of with some nuance, And so I'm not saying no Twitter. I mean, it exists, and I understand why for people's careers it has, and it's put a bunch of issues on the table. There's no question about that. It's like it's sort of given voice to people who are excluded. There's no question about it. And indigenous issues and organizing and Black Lives Matter. I mean, things have been. It's created some opportunities for change. There's no question about that. But it has a toxic and damaging, effect on our intellectual life that I think we have to have some serious conversations about. I can't see having these conversations on Twitter or social media, the complexities of that.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to this observation, I think that paradoxically, Trump being on platforms is good for democracy in Canada. Like, Trump is really bad for American democracy. There's no question about it. But the effect of Trump on Twitter for Canadian politicians was our Conservative Party became our Liberal Party. Our Liberal Party became our NDP party. And our NDP party didn't really do anything, right? And so I think that in some ways, we have a tendency to look at the media ecosystem through the lens of the United States.
Yeah.
But in Canada, it's actually had healthy effects on the way that our democracy operates.
Do you think it's healthy though? Like I mean, in some ways, like essentially, see, I think it's very unhealthy for Liberal Party or the NDP to, in the long run, to get people to vote for you because we're not them.
Yeah.
Like we need a positive, transformative, radical agenda that gets the majority of people online for very difficult conversations and very difficult change that has to happen. So I don't think just pointing to Trump, even though it kind of moves the conversation away, you do have this, you do have an online, I'm writing about this, about, Ezra Levant and Lauren Southern, and we have, the Peterson thing. Peterson is not a Nazi or a white nationalist. He's not, but he's having a very unhealthy, influence on things. And so I don't think that's really, I don't think it's healthy in the long run. I think we have to confront these issues on the table and get people to be, the Liberal parties, you get Michael Ignatieff and you get Justin Trudeau, right? It's kind of these celebrity intellectuals, and you point to the Trump and say, do you want to do that? And then you say, like, abortion rights, vote for us. I just don't think that's a very positive, in the long run, where you have a political vision of a new Canada that comes with some kind of difficult reconciliation and transfer of land back and some new relationship with Indigenous people. Very hard conversation. We got to change energy sources. Hard conversation. There's a lot of hard conversations, And we now live in a scary world, with authoritarian Chinese communism and, kind of Russia now. And so these are going to be very conversation. I think we have to talk in a more serious way than don't vote for us because it could get worse because you could have Trump. I just, not good. No, I agree. Trudeau is not an intellectual. That's the problem, right? It's sort of like it's a kind of he was Michael Ignatieff was an intellectual, but part of the story here is intellectuals suck at politics. So this is where with Fromm was a great intellectual, but politics is something different. It requires a kind of compromise or something else. So Ignatieff was a terrible politician and a great intellectual. Trudeau is no intellectual at all. He's a kind of a media figure and somebody with a figurehead for the party and a kind of a brand. And so but both of those things are kind of brands. Bringing back Trudeau, the original, an intellectual, and then bringing back Trudeau, the son. They're both branding strategies for the Liberal Party, as opposed to an actual positive agenda. I would want to push that to the left from an NDP that puts more focus, I think, on some class issues and the working poor and kind of things, in my opinion, than what's being focused on now. But, I'm basically sympathetic to that. But we need a positive agenda and hard conversations, not just pointing to the US and the chaos of the US to scare people. It's not enough.
Look over there.
Yeah. That's what's happening, no? I mean, and there's a there's a growing right-wing popular movement. I think the convoy is a bit more complicated than Trudeau. That's what he did. Look over there, and so as opposed to trying to come up with policies that include everyone as much as possible, and some people are just not going to be able to include them because they're white rationalists or they're racists or they're reactionaries. I mean, they're not going to be part of that consensus. But you don't want to be just dumping everybody into that category for and that's what I think. That kind of politics is not that helpful, I don't think.
I just want to quickly dovetail on one of the tangents about Twitter and social media. I wonder if Twitter is an escape from something. I'm speaking as my own bias here is that I'm someone who don't use Twitter at all, who's almost never used Twitter, who's never had an account. But when I look in the mirror and reflect, it seems like my dislike for Twitter resembles the reason why a lot of right-wingers on YouTube say they dislike Twitter, which is very strange. And again, it makes me think about, is there a sort of a stratification factor behind which demographic or which class demographic is more susceptible to Twitter? Right. And that's not necessarily to blame Twitter users for using it or to make fun of people who don't use it. It's to look at, through the lens of like Twitter usage, perhaps we can use that as a jumping board to ask, what is the social tier? What is the tier in our social fabric? How is our society actually divided? Beyond what Canadian Conservative Party likes to say, we're divided, they're dividing us, and so on and so on. How is our society actually divided? What is the class tier? And perhaps,
I would say the thing to do with Fromm in that conversation, you should do that kind of research. That's so important research. The thing that Fromm could add to that is, what is the social psychology when people are using social media? Because I think that there's an enormous amount of, Fromm would never had a Twitter page. He would never have a Facebook page. I mean, he was kind of a technophile, or phobe. He didn't really like new technology. He's a bit old fashioned. That was sort of he was kind of a radical rooted in tradition. It's kind of like, that's sort of his. So I don't think we can rely on Fromm for that. But at the same time, social media is a place where there's an enormous amount of projections, where people see something and they project their own feelings and fears onto other people, and it displays things, and there's sort of, and it's also creating, it's like the social production. There's something I think someone should do. It's like Christopher Lasch, who really disliked Fromm because he was an Orthodox Freudian, and he had to play the role in sort of undermining Fromm's reputation. And I think politically, lots of critical things to say about Lasch, but he has this great book called The Culture of Narcissism. And Twitter has created a culture of narcissism. That is, it's socially produced, that people over time are living in the world of their own sort of immediate reactions that is quickened by Twitter. And it's creating an inability of sort of like to step back and look at things in that world. So I think that there's a social psychology of social, Jonathan Haidt is sort of has a kind of some of this stuff, but I think we need a more politically radical version of Jonathan Haidt, something a bit more incisive and a bit more critical.
Amazing. I think that is a brilliant note to end on. Elham has just notified me that if we want to go over time, we might have to extend our session, but I don't think there's any need for that. I want to thank Neil. This has been a wonderful discussion, and it's been so insightful to hear the reflections that really come from a career oriented towards thinking about really important problems, about how we shift politics, how we think about the world and global society, but also how we can use sociology to make meaningful change in people's lives, and how people like Erich Fromm have done that. And so I want to really extend the warmest thank you, Neil. It is absolutely a pleasure to get to hear about your book. As equally a warm pleasure to my colleagues, Alex and Robert. It is so good to see both of you after 5 years of being away from each other. It's so wonderful to see how your careers have moved forward. And I just want to thank everybody who was able to attend our session. So I wish you a wonderful rest of Congress. Neil, Alex, Robert, thank you.
Thank you. And it's so great to watch. I'm really excited about watching your careers moving from the suboptimal margins to the optimal margin of the field, building sociology in Canada. We're in good shape with your hands and other people in the association. So thank you.
Take care, fellows.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.